So I'm going to be talking about the sugar industry and the growth of it and changes in it. Variations to the map initially named Jens Michelsen Beck. So, and I want to touch on a few things here. I'm going to look today in the presentation, I'll look at the sugar industry and its history in global perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about the survey done of St. Croix in the Danish period. We'll talk about Beck a little bit, the maps that he created. We're going to look at some elaborations based on his maps and talk about some things about the relation between them and the accuracy of the information and some things that we might be able to learn from that. And, you know, I just got a note that my internet connection was unstable. So I'm going to go into a different room where the internet. Peripatetic performance. Right. And I'm going to spend a substantial time in the presentation today talking about idiosyncrasies in some of the maps and raising interesting questions about the dates that they're in and why they included information, what had changed between maps, and trying to get more of a chronology and point out some things that people think that there's the Beck map, and most people. And I'm going to talk about quite a number of variations. And I will invite you, if you have clarifying questions on a specific topic, to please ask them right away and to hold discussions to the end. You know, if you've got some broader discussion questions, and I love to answer questions. So, and I will value your questions actually to help me inform my research, because I've learned some things that some of them I just can't figure out. So I'm looking forward to some great questions and discussion. So, all right. So, you know, I've been thinking about the sugar industry and why it's important, because I think in any research, when you're doing any sort of presentation or thought, it's like, why are you telling me this? You know, why is this important? Why should I give a flying flip? And that's a highly technical term. If you need me to explain that to you, just let me know. Send me a chat. But there's a few things that globally happened because of the Caribbean sugar industry that really changed the course of history for like lots and lots of people. And the first thing is the chattel slavery of Africans. If it wasn't for the Caribbean sugar industry, chattel slavery of Africans would have, if it ever occurred, would have looked extraordinarily different. So you wouldn't have enslaved people, certainly to the degree that it happened. And one reason that Europeans turned to chattel slavery is they had been doing indentured servitude, but the survival rate for the Europeans that they brought to the Caribbean indentured servitude was in the low single digits. And they couldn't recruit anybody else to come because people realized it was a death sentence because all their predecessors had died, and that word gets back. And so, you know, this is something to think about, that the Europeans are trying to solve a labor problem. I think nobody would argue that it was a good solution, but it was a solution that they turned to. The second big issue is the commodification of sugar. In my research, I've discovered that Queen Elizabeth, that lived during the Shakespearean era, her teeth were black and falling out because she was among the sort of individuals that could afford to eat sugar. And she apparently had a sweet tooth, and it literally rotted the teeth out of her head. Through the period from the 17th century through the 19th century, so the 1600s to the 1800s, basically sugar became processed and available so that it became a middle class and even lower class product. And, you know, today we see some of the after effects of that with things like diabetes, obesity, and food poverty, and that sort of thing. Malnutrition, even though you eat plenty of calories. This is in part driven by the entire Caribbean sugar industry. Certainly its genesis. And it's inarguable that European colonization and piracy really its form and basis in the Caribbean, in the Caribbean sugar industry. There's lots of colorful tales of piracy, and that then had an impact on the globalization of trade, which impacted shipping. I mean, I think about people like Alexander Hamilton, who lived on St. Croix, and the practical challenges you get faced with of, okay, I'm going to load this ship up with sugar, rum, molasses, and I'm going to write some letters to the captain and the people on the receiving end. And I'm going to tell the captain, oh, say, for instance, you have to go to London and you can't go anywhere between now and then. How do you know that happens? And so these systems started globally maturing. Along with that, global systems of finance, and then the military protection, that certainly made massive advancements during this period. So these are some really significant things that happened during the Caribbean sugar industry. And one other factor that's really interesting from an economic development standpoint is that the sugar industry, the colonial sugar industry, was the first industry which really had a substantial unification of agriculture and manufacturing in the same productive unit. So the plantation was the first place where you're growing an agricultural product, and then you're actually processing right there in a substantial way to transform it, because you can't export sugarcane, so you have to process it into some other product. And this was something new. So the people that were running this were actually qualified in a number of ways, because they have to be able to grow a crop, and they also have to manage manufacturing. So it's an interesting period in terms of the industrialization and that sort of impact on human evolution. So now let's talk more specifically about St. Croix and its relation. The French pretty much abandoned St. Croix in 1685. In fact, the residents here were instructed by the French to get on ships, go over to what's now Haiti, and basically burn everything behind them so somebody couldn't come back and settle behind them. And St. Croix was largely vacant for about 4 years. You had some English squatters come in, not much sugar. The Danes elected not to kick them off because they really needed the abilities of these people to start the new colony, to make it viable. And the Danes took an approach to say, we'll take all comers because we don't have a lot of experience growing sugar, and we want people to come in and make this go. Now, when the Danish purchased St. Croix in 1733, this was very late for sugar production. Barbados was close to peaking at this point. Jamaica was already online in a big way. Antigua was cranking. St. Kitts. So St. Croix was pretty late in the period for sugar production, but that actually created some advantages of having people that could move here that had a lot of experience and had built some wealth in other places doing the work. And it took about 15 years to really get production established. They had to do a survey so you can give clear title to the land, and that took a good decade. They had to clear the land, and if anybody lives on St. Croix, you know that clearing land is, in this day and age, even with bulldozers and power tools, is not necessarily a simple thing to do. And so that took an awful lot of work. And as I mentioned, they've recruited a lot of experienced settlers, and then they have to have a capital investment for being able to run their enterprise with both agriculture and manufacturing. So you have to get the land, you've got to clear it, you've got to prep it for being able to plant sugar. You have to have the labor to be able to do that. And then on the manufacturing side, you have to build equipment to both crush the cane and then boil it down into sugar molasses and then potentially make rum. And just one quick point, St. Croix, in relation to this, the company, the Danish West Indian Guinea Company, was charged with administrating St. Croix starting in 1733, and they were relieved of their duty in 1754 because they just weren't producing the results that were being sought. So as there was a change in administration, one of the impetuses for publishing the map in 1754 by Beck that we'll talk about. So just a quick little thing about St. Croix under the French administration. Anybody that knows the geography of St. Croix will recognize that this map by Lapointe in 1761 has something of a distorted impression of St. Croix, especially a swollen east end. And you'll notice I've turned this upside down because the map itself has got south going at the top of the page. And so I just flipped it upside down so that you would get the more familiar view. But if you look from basically anything east of Great Pond, there were no names, which meant that nobody was living there. You have quite a bit of settlement between Great Pond and Christiansted, then a little bit west of Christiansted through Salt River, scatterings in between that, and then a decent presence in the Frederiksted area in the West End. But they definitely created a distortion impression of what St. Croix looked like, which created the impetus to do the survey and say, all right, how much land actually is there? So the survey that the Danes did is quite remarkable because it's a unique rectilinear approach. You know, you've seen the maps of St. Croix and look at them again. Everything's in little squares. Yeah, makes it administratively really easy, but not necessarily easy to work on the ground because you've got hills and streams and coastline and everything that goes along with, you know, real geography. But the approach in St. Croix is extremely consequential of being the first really major European approach to taking this kind of administrative separate subdivision of the land in the island in a location so that you can just put them very neatly on a map. And as I mentioned, the survey took over a decade. And one of the reasons why the Europeans that got sent here to lead the survey, they'd often die within 6 months. Remember, there was at this point in history, Walter Reed had not discovered that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes. That was in the 20th century. And so people would get disease like malaria, yellow fever, and related stuff. And it's very possible that, you know, symptoms of that sort of thing at this time were all called the same disease. And these people, the Europeans that came over, died at an extraordinarily high rate, including the surveyors, and this slowed them down. Now, they did have difficulty getting access to labor. If you're familiar at all with the survey of St. Croix, literally what was going on is people were hacking through the bush, cutting lines, and dragging large chains of hundreds of or thousands of feet. That's pretty heavy stuff. That's hard work. And they had crews that were called Compass Negroes. And these are enslaved peoples that were lent by property owners. And they actually did an awful lot of the work. And I would think that that would be a great, interesting, if you could find enough information to find out anything about the individuals that did this, because they're actually responsible for the on the ground work that got done. And I've been told by quite a few surveyors that the survey that itself, in terms of the distance between the boundary posts and all that, is pretty accurate on St. Croix. So they actually did a really good job physically in the field. Another issue slowing the survey down was equipment. You know, imagine this: you're on St. Croix today and you want something very specific, and no local merchant has it available, and you're like, oh, I have to wait, 2 weeks for it to be shipped or whatever. Well, at that point in time, I have to send a letter to Europe. They have to process it and send it back. So it takes forever to get anything. It's one of these constants in Virgin Islands history that it takes forever to get specialized stuff here. So they had equipment that got broken, got lost, damaged, whatever. They couldn't use it. So that would slow them down. And also just having the expertise in doing these surveys was difficult. And especially when you're talking about Europeans that are still learning about the Caribbean environment and coming here for the first time and seeing very different topography, vegetation, everything else than they might have been experiencing back in Europe. And we'll look at the Kronenberg and von Jagersberg map from 1750, and this was the first full island map under the Danish period, which was a vast improvement over the French maps. And it's very likely that the data collection stopped in October of 1749. And anybody that loves musicals is probably familiar with the musical Hamilton. And Mr. Cronenberg is the man that Alexander Hamilton's wife was shacking up with, her mother was shacking up with, and then she was imprisoned in the fort, as was he, and they were both kicked off of St. Croix for their misdeeds. And so that's why I can pretty securely say there was very minor information collection after October 1749, because Mr. Cronenberg was kind of not so popular for a little while. So this is a picture of the Danish map, the Cronenberg and von Jagersberg map, and few things. The yellow colors that you see that is land that's planted in sugarcane. You can see structures that are in red and black, and you'll notice up here on the north side, I think you can see my mouse, that this coastline doesn't look like the real coastline that we know today. And part of that is they just physically couldn't get up to the north side. It's a pretty rugged area, and it was covered in lots of trees. And so this was the last part of St. Croix that was surveyed. And an interesting thing here is I've exploded Frederiksted over here, because Frederiksted wasn't even planned when they wrote this map. Frederiksted was not approved to be a city until September, October of 1751. And then on the Beck map, you'll see the things. And what's interesting is for Frederiksted, the translation is drawing to the town, which is basically saying, oh, this is a plan. And for Christiansted, it's drawing of the town, because Christiansted existed. We're going to see an explosion here of Christiansted in a subsequent image. But you see, Christiansted is laid out because it actually existed as a town at that point. So here we have, there's Christiansted right there. And I bring this up because Jens Michelsen Beck, the man that designed the maps that we're going to look at, he was already an established landowner in 1749. He's owning what today is estate Orange Grove, or a portion thereof. And then in King's Quarter, estate 14, he also is indicated the landowner names were written in. He's also written in here. And he was, he did survey work, but he often did survey work for private individuals, and he got into some legal challenges because it was alleging that he was getting paid to manipulate information to the benefit of some of the landowners at the expense of the company and then the crown. And so he's got, in one issue there with the first legal challenge, there's some evidence that he stopped collecting some data in 1752, which will help date one of the maps. And it's very clear that he followed the survey of Cronenberg and von Jagersberg. I'm not sure why my slide keeps moving. Sorry about that. And we're going to see Beck designed two iconic maps, and these maps are now the basis for quite a few annotated and manuscript maps that we're going to look at for the rest of the presentation. So for the Beck maps, there's at least 24 individual examples that survive that I've seen in archives. You have both prints and manuscript copies, and remarkably, very few are exactly the same. So as I look at the research and think about things, I look at questions like, well, what did each one depict, and how can you tell them apart? And how can you use that information to date things and to corroborate evidence presented in a map with records from other places? And other questions are why they depicted things. And I'm always asking the question, how accurate is the information you're looking at? Is it correct? Is it inaccurate? And you'll see some places where there are some inaccuracies that I'm pretty confident I can say, yeah, the map here is wrong, because the evidence on the ground or evidence from other documentation is so clear that, yeah, you made a boo-boo here. And that's, again, a highly technical term. And I'm really happy to discuss those at the question and answer, these highly technical terms that I'm often accused of using. So data that's included, you have a map. Obviously, you're going to want an island. You want your coastlines, your salt ponds. And we mentioned the mosquito-borne diseases. If you look across St. Croix, it is pretty interesting that strategically placed, you have places where mosquitoes will breed. Salt River Bay, the pond at Rustop Twist, up here at the west end near Hams Bay. There's the body of water down here by Frederickstead, the Sandy Point, this Krause's Lagoon that was not in the Danish times, was not a refinery. Imagine that. You've got Southgate Pond, Coakley Bay, Great Pond. So you have these ponds all over where mosquitoes can breed and then get people sick with mosquito-borne diseases. So just a quick sideline, they didn't actually depict that on the maps, go figure. So you got coastlines, ponds, and streams. And at the time, the streams actually were flowing water. There's quite a bit of evidence for that. You have quarter and estate boundaries. So the quarters, there's, they weren't math geniuses actually, or the math genius and the words that are used, because there's 9 quarters. And if you say 9 quarters, that's like 2 1/4 islands worth of land. But I think they meant quarters in the sense of a place where people lived. And then you have the estate boundaries that are the little rectangles within it. The quarter boundaries are all the very heavy lines. And you have your towns and roads, and you'll see here at the top, this is the plan of Frederickstead. The fort is here, and the south part of Frederickstead was developed as a town. The north side never was. So you can go out there now. There's beach, it's beautiful, open land, a few structures, but yeah, that was supposed to be a town and just never developed that way. You have some place names, and I've got one very extraordinarily interesting question I have on a place name. And obviously a lot of the place names are the various bays around the island. And then you have the quarter names in each quarter. And then very interesting, you have the sugar crushing machinery. So you have an animal mill and a windmill. And the big impetus for including the animal mill and the windmill was at this period, during the whole period in which the survey was going, one of the questions from Denmark is how much sugar production is going on. So in this map, he clearly, in a no-nonsense way, say, all right, there's sugar production capacity, windmill, animal mill. So something that I appreciate, I've been working with Daniel Hopkins some, and he pointed out the fact that Beck actually printed 2 maps, okay? Most people are familiar with the map on the right here, which has got 21 windmills. Well, the first version, I'm assuming, is a previous version because it's got less information on it. It had 8 windmills and 74 animal mills. And I'm sorry, but let me move. I've got the little chat box. Let me hide that. So you've got the data is, I believe, from 1752, but down here at the bottom, it says it's printed in 1754, because imagine this, they're actually taking a big piece of metal and engraving this to make the maps. And then they added information to create the second map, which had 21 min mills, 94 animal mills. I'm dating it from about 1755, because if you take the number of windmills and you start with 3 in 1749, 8 in 1752, 117 in 1794 when Oxholm published his map, 1755 fits right on that line. And so at this point, I'm still working through analyzing some of this stuff, but I'm saying the data's from about 1755, no idea when they actually printed it, because you have no additional information to give you that, at least just looking at the maps. So, and just a note about my methods. Basically, what I've focused on mainly is looking at the manuscript maps and corroborating that with field work I've done trying to find windmills on St. Croix, and some documentary history, not a lot of documentary history. So many people are going to be familiar with some of these annotated maps. This one on the left and the one in the center in particular have shown up as popular printed maps. And there's dating here on this one from 1766, this one from 1767. And then it doesn't show over here, but in the legend on the right, this one was dated 1770 in handwriting. Now, a couple interesting things about this map, these maps. This first map on the left is based on the first printing. So there's only 8 windmills that were printed on this piece of paper first and 54 animal mills. And then the hand drawing added all the other information onto the map. And this map depicts 60 windmills and 85 animal mills. The table indicates 63 windmills. Now, I have for a long time wondered if map makers can count, but I'm pretty sure that they were able to at least get to 60. So getting to 63, we can handle that. I think might be what happened is they got the information that created this table and they just hand wrote that in as a piece of information, and then they added the windmills in specific locations where they knew that they existed, and the same with the animal mills. Now, for each one of these annotations, and the annotation I'll show on the next slide, it's got the landowner names for each of the estates, and the colorations that are the same color that go across state boundaries means that the same person owned the adjoining estates. Now, the same colors in non-adjoining areas don't mean that that's the same person that owns that. And so you've got this map that was hand dated 1766. This one is hand dated 1767. And this one 1770. The 2 maps on the right were from the second printing, and it's the one in the center has 60 windmills. The one on the right is 21 windmills. Both have 94 animal mills, and in fact, this 94 animal mills, I want to check that. That might not be accurate. I'll have to check my math. Counting things can be very difficult sometimes, and you'll see a reason why when we get in a moment. But the map on the right was far more interested in the names of the landowners than it was on the productive capacity, where the ones on the left are equally interested in the names and the productive capacity. Now, I just literally came across this map yesterday. Have not had a chance to really analyze it to the extent that I know that this is a map that isn't included. It's not information that it's included on the ones we just looked at. And these have 65 windmills. It's got landowner names. I'm thinking it might be around 1770. You notice the table that was on the other maps is missing. So I know it's not one of the other maps. And I want to do some more analysis of this map to get a better picture of where, try to date it more precisely. And really what caught my attention was the blue around Frederiksted. I'm like, wait, I've never seen that, because this map here looks quite a bit like this map, and but it contains unique information. Now, this is a map that is a manuscript map, and a manuscript map is basically taking Beck's map as the basis and then just hand copying it. And there's only one copy of this that I found. So instead of taking the printed map, you're like, okay, let's just create a de novo map. And you'll see it's got the towns up here, and then the legend, and then the cartouche. And those are information that are copied straight from the original map. You have a landowner table down here that we haven't seen that on any maps. I'm going to consider these in detail in a moment. And then there was an image over here that is not reproduced on this map. Now, counted up the windmills, and I said, well, there's only 20 windmills. And that's because in estate 29 of Prince Quarter, the windmill, it appears on the second printed map, and it's not on this map. I think this is probably an error of omission, and just one of these intriguing things of, all right, what happened? So there's 3 other manuscript maps. The one on the left here is attributed to 1776 or 1766 by the archives. And the table down here matches this table that we saw in the previous 2 maps, the annotated maps. And while adds up to 63 windmill, on the map itself, you only have 57 windmills. And it does include the landowner names. And one thing I love about this is the landowner names are really easy to read, because some of the script can be really hard to read. And it's nice to then say, okay, is that actually what I'm seeing in the other? Because sometimes the script is hard to read. This one in the center here, down here, is dated in 1766. And this is by a man named Zollner. And this is, again, an annotated map where, or excuse me, a manuscript map where he basically is copying Beck and adding the landowner names, hand coloring, hand tinting. And in this case, both the table and the map have 63. So either he was good at counting or actually included all the information on the map. And then this one on the right is intriguing. It's by a man named Kufner, a German guy, and Christian Oldendorp wrote a book, and this map was included in the book about Oldendorp was a Moravian missionary that came down to St. Croix. And there's interesting stuff about that. Just a quick aside, the book that Oldendorp wrote is quite different than the book that got published, because in this day and age, the day and age that he published it, his publisher made it a lot more politically correct and changed a lot of stuff that Oldendorp had written. I know Arnie Highfield has translated it. The translation is from the published version and not the original German manuscript, which contains different. So in this map, the sugar mill, the plantation with a sugar mill is the little X with the line through it with the circle under it. And that does not differentiate between a windmill and an animal mill. There's 72 mills there, and then 177 other structures where you can see quite a few places where there's a circle and just a line. And one thing interesting about this map is if you draw in horizontal and vertical lines, every single one of the demarcations where a plantation should be falls neatly into that box. So this is not a just randomly placing the icons on the map. This is a lot more accurate, and a lot of the icons correspond with what is found on the other maps. And you also have some of the landowner names included, although sometimes it's a little unclear which icon that the name corresponds with. So this is just a blow up of the map to give you a better idea. And say, for instance, you go across this line here under Hendrickson's name, all those lines, all these icons are very parallel. And when you put the lines in for the estates, all these fit nicely and neatly into estates. Yeah, I'm geeky enough to have done that. So, and the last two manuscript maps that we are going to touch on are two nearly identical copies of Beck that were 1790, 1791. And these only have property owner names, and they've got all the other requisite things that you would expect on a map of the time. No depiction of sugar machinery. But again, this is useful information. And in some cases, from the earlier maps, you'll have a man's name. And then on these maps, you'll have that person's heirs or that person's widow, which I think is very interesting. And that shows that women and children could own land. And I don't know all the details, but they're able to own the land and keep the property in the same hands moving forward. And just an interesting point of history that they didn't have to sell the property because they weren't legally able to own it. So in this last portion of the presentation, I want to just go through some of the icons and what they represent to make sure that you've got a clear picture in your mind of what Beck is trying to show with on the map, and then how that was, there's a lot of consistencies and inconsistencies. And so up here in the upper left, this is how in the legend, he shows a windmill that he's going to have and an animal mill, and the windmills and the animal mills are pretty close to what would have actually appeared on the landscape. And here's a picture of a mill from Antigua, and the St. Croix windmills look substantially similar to this. And this here on the right side of the right diagram is an
Okay,
animal.
that's why he has those images. Okay.
I'm sorry? So, all right, so this is an animal mill. And again, it looks pretty, the icon that's used is echoes it very closely. One very interesting thing when you look at the map in detail and look at the different icons, and remember these are hand engraved, so it's not like they're taking a machine and stamping it. They're taking some carving device and carving into a metal plate so they can create, printing plate so they can create the maps. And you have, like here in Estate 18 in King Quarter, you have this icon with two little dots and then a little blob in between. And compared to the more standard, okay, you got four little rectangles under the where the arms would be for the animal mill. And the icon in Estate 18 was far more common from this point and west. And then it doesn't appear east of this estate. And I'm thinking that there might have been different people that actually did some of the engraving, because you have quite a few variations. And I've selected these just to highlight that, yeah, they're not all the same. In this case, the arms don't touch the base. In most other cases, they do. Then you have, say, down here in the lower left, you have, it doesn't all line up like it does in some of the other pictures. Here you have another one where the arm in East End, the arms don't touch, and there's more rectangles than the four. And here's, sorry, this one, it doesn't all line up. So you can see that there's a variation. And then you see up in the upper right, you have a printing defect, if you will, that it doesn't look like all the ink got onto the page or the ink wore away in this instance. And this is going to recur later. So you see a variety of depictions of this same piece of equipment. So on the first printing, all the windmills that were included look pretty much the same. The sails are more or less facing east. You have the tail, and I'm brain fart, the tail pole here that help move. Yes.
7 more minutes.
Okay, you got the tail pole, and they all look pretty much the same. As in the second printing, the windmills don't all look the same. And part of that is they're taking what was an animal mill and adding sails to it. And you can see on the right column, you've got these were plantations where there was nothing there before, and now they added the windmill here. And in this case, it's very interesting that they had an animal mill here, they scratched it out and created a windmill over here. A few things on the annotated maps. They added de novo animal mills. Here's an example of one that they just put in with pen. You can see it's different than the ones that were printed. And they added de novo windmills. Here's an example in 18 and 26 of ones that they added. And they include planter names. And here's an example. Christopher McAvoy owned quite a bit down here in the south where is it Grenard, Grange, Diamond, well, they don't have Diamond Couture here, but heading east into areas near Longford, all in this gray color. Christopher McAvoy and Nicholas Tweet would have owned those. Now on these manuscript maps, or excuse me, on the annotated maps, I'm not confident that the mill locations are particularly accurate, because say in this case, you wanted to, you don't, if this was farther south, you couldn't write it because you already have existing writing. Now, there's a question that I discovered while I was preparing this slide, actually. I hadn't noticed before. Watch House Point is presented differently in the first printing. Remember, this map is the first printing versus this map, the second printing. And I'm having a tough time explaining that. Every other one seems to be identical, and I don't know what happened here. I'm really looking for some help on this one. So just another thing, the LeGrand Princess, there's a vet's office there now. there was 2 windmills. You have the original mill and then the second mill. There's depicted similarly on the 2 annotated maps. You have no landowner information because this was the company's plantation. And this matches what found in the field. And you have 2 windmills that were east and west. One is actually in the bush as just a foundation. And then the one that's actually quite evident if you drive up to the property. Now you also have, I've noted before, your conversion of the animal mills to windmills, and you're adding material, adding stuff, and they're adding different property owners, and not all the boundaries are consistent between the maps. And that's one thing I'm going to go through and check the names versus the landowner list. And now here's something that I found quite intriguing. In Queen Quarter Estate 23 and Company Quarter Estate 12, on the first map, you have an animal mill. On the second printing, it looks like they've tried to obscure that so it doesn't show up. And I put 3 different examples of the same map to show that it doesn't show up equivalently. So I don't know if they tried to obscure it and then they didn't quite get it. And then as they went to later printings, they either obscured it more or just the ink wasn't sticking there for some reason. And then you can see on the annotated maps, this shows up because this is the first printing and the second printing, but here you have a shadow of the animal mill. And again, this is something that I'm seeking to explain.
Bill, 3 more minutes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. The mill locations do appear intentional within this estate, and you've got north and south. And when I went into the field, I circled where they are, and you have some interesting consistencies. And then, like for instance, 3 was initially said it was in estate 3, but actually, and in Morningstar it shows up in estate 10. So, but the position from the original printing, it does seem that Beck was trying to be very intentional on where they're located. Now, I believe there's an error in putting in the mill at Concordia near Frederickstead, and initially they put it west of the road in estate 21. It should be in estate 20, like it shows up here in the Oxholm map. It was corrected in the Zollner map. And this mill was built in 1749. It shows up here and it has a date stone inscription that I'm pretty sure is accurate. Another thing that got changed was the shoreline. You have the original shoreline here, and then you can see it was actually scratched out in the second map, this map here, and then this map, they actually physically moved it down. And then these maps are different variations of that, and comparing it with a satellite photo, none of them are completely accurate, but relatively close. And then last thing I'm going to bring up is the inclusion of a table with the property owner names that happens in a number of instances. I've gone through and I've found that the names aren't quite identical. There's 127 names in the top. You have 124 over here. And I've got 5 instances where names were omitted between tables, some spelling variations. And then in some cases, you've got a windmill with no property owner indicated, which is fascinating. So, and this is inconsistent with the property owner list that Westergaard published in a paper that he wrote. So conclusions, the maps appear representative up to a point. We've got some errors and omissions. The locations seem pretty accurate. The information on some of the manuscript maps may be inconsistent. I think that's going to take a little bit more research to nail it down. And you have different base information on the 2 printings. And you see that there's different map bases for the various maps. So what's next? I'm going to take the property owners and compare them across the maps and tables. I've started to do that. And then compare this with landowner records and check against the dates of the maps. So we can more accurately date what the information that's depicted on the maps are. And I hope that we have some time for questions. I'm sorry if I waxed on too much. Questions?
I have a question. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay, this is Leonore. A couple of questions I have actually. You mentioned Beck as a cartographer. Was he also the architect that designed Frederick's?
I don't know who actually designed it. He laid out the plan,
Right?
but beyond that, I'm pretty sure the individual, the property owners would have some sort of architect that would design the building that was built. So I'm not aware that he did that. He's more of a surveyor. And so I don't know of any architectural talents that he had.
Okay, that's what I read somewhere. And also, you mentioned that there were no plans to build a town in Frederickstead, and then that map, the one map you showed, that Frederickstead was outlined in blue. Do you know why? And why there were no plans?
Well, they built the fort in, is it 1756, I think. And they built the town to the south. They never built the portion of the town to the north of the fort. So they started it and just never finished it. I'm not aware of any the documentation around that. I'm sorry. I can't tell you much more than that. Just the fact that part of it's there. You can go visit it today. And it's been there for a long time, but why they did the south half first and then never did the north half, I don't know. A very interesting question.
And the blue around part of Frederickstead is now in the one map you mentioned it.
So you're talking about this map here?
Yes. That one in the
So-
middle. There, that one.
So yeah, so what you see here on this map is just the base map that this is Beck. And I think one reason that they probably started on the south first is you got the gut that comes through that was probably a pond at the time. They didn't build it north. Now and he shows it on the map here and then exploded view here. So I'm not sure if I'm following the rest of the question.
Well, you said you didn't know why Frederickstead was in blue. And so I'm wondering why. Why is it in blue?
This is just a hand tinting thing and stylistic. This map paints it colors it yellow. Yeah, I think this is just a stylistic thing. And whereas I'm looking for the other manuscript, this one, I think colors it yellow. There's another one that colors it yellow. So it's just, artistic license.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Lynn Frederickson has a question.
Yes, I was just wondering from your first statement about the initial start of the agricultural industry, the processing as well as the production on site. And are there any studies that talk at all about the social implications of that at the time? I mean, we know what the long-term implications are, certainly for the industrialization of agriculture, but it's just interesting I've never thought about it in terms of the Caribbean sugar industry. And I'm wondering if there are any studies that look into those social implications on the ground.
Well, certainly on the ground, you have a lot of enslaved laborers that probably was not their first choice to get put on a boat from Africa and shipped over to the Caribbean. And so that's going to have massive social implications. And I believe the ratio was like between 7 and 15 to 1 in terms of enslaved people versus Europeans. And, I mentioned that the society at that time was very brutal. And because people died at a very young age from all kinds of diseases and overwork. And the overwork is what killed a lot of the indentured servants. And I think it kind of that whole set, it's in some ways I look at it and say and I don't know of a lot of studies, but this was a great example of how humans can be very cruel to one another. To further their own personal ends, I'm just going to beat the crap out of somebody else. Excuse my language, but it's like, I don't really care about you as a person. I just want you to work. And if you die, that's your problem, and I'm sure that there have been some studies done. And one thing with my research is I would love to have other scholars. I want to create data for other scholars to be able to easily access and start answering some of those sorts of questions, because they're fascinating questions. Because the legacy that has been left by that is what we live with today, the systems that were built up. I mean, you look at St. Croix, the land ownership patterns. These are the way that the map was drawn. This is what we live with today, where the roads are. We largely live with that today, right? And so you have these systems that were set up 250, 300 years ago, and they're with us today. That has a way of coloring everything. Place names were very largely in place in the period of Beck's name, because I see the planter's name like Castle Burke. A guy named Burke owned it at the time. Okay, that's a place name that was in place there, and we still use that today. And I think those things are, really ripe for people to explore further. And, I personally look at this is our history. There were good aspects and bad aspects to it. And there was a lot of bad aspects in terms of the cruelty and all the crap that went down, people hurting other people. But let's reckon with it, let's deal with it, and let's use it to move ourselves forward in a positive, productive way. So they say, hey, we're all living here now. How can we make the best of the world that we live in? Because this is a beautiful place. And how do we make it a better place for everybody with a lot of respect, for mutual respect? And I think that I'm hoping that we can move towards that as a society and say, I look at the windmills, that was all, they were actually built by people that were enslaved. And I believe some of the laborers worked their way to freedom by being good masons. And there's nothing that I do that's going to be around 200 years from now, but I guarantee you that some of these windmills will still be standing in 200 years. And they're already 250, 300 years old. So, it's to me, it's this creative legacy. So hope I answered your question.
Do we have any other
Yes,
questions?
That was wonderful.
I
Thank
see
Yes.
Celeste.
Yes, hi, it's Celeste. First of all, before I even get started, thank you for the whole windmill that you said, because I actually wrote a poem about the fact why they was built, and that the fact that they're still standing and that my ancestors put them up. Thank you for that statement. Okay. Okay. So what I'm interested in also is, like you talked about the name placements, like the Burke. I live up in the rainforest, the Crickeys, it's Cricky Dam. And, I found the later information. I am a descendant of the Crickeys. Later information about it. I also live on property that I go back and I can see a Cricky, and then around the perimeters were the Marcoux, and found some information about that genealogy wise, which I'm coming in, my ancestry data comes into that as well. So I'm wondering, moving forward and talking about a windmill, let me go back a little bit, a windmill in the rainforest, where now we have this windmill is not on where the land is, but actually on the side that the rainforest roads were dug into. So I'm trying to see, how do I move forward and get the information on some of that? What maps show some of that? Because I've been digging in these maps, definitely, because, genealogy wise, historically as well. Maybe you can help me kind of forward me in some of that direction. Because, one last thing, because I live on over half an acre, but at the time they said this was a plantation. So how did they break these plantations down then into acreages?
Right. Okay, so the plantations, and Betsy, did you plant this question? I'm pretty sure you must have, because I'm going to talk about a project. I'm pretty sure you did, but that's okay. So the plantations were 2,000 feet by 3,000 feet, not 2,000 by 3,000 feet, Danish feet. And that was the intent. You see this in here, it's very clear to see the very neat presentation of this, little squares and boxes, and the map administrator loved that, because I can sit in my office and ooh, square little box, and that creates some problems in the field. But the survey was largely accurate. Now you're talking about the windmills. I am in the process of developing a website of every windmill that was ever built on St. Croix based on 17 or 18 now historic maps. And it's going to be 160 pages. There are going to be about 150 different estates that are in there. And within each estate page will have 17 images or 18 images from each one of the maps that I've looked at, to show you just, I do a little square like I did with, let me get to this, like with this. Okay, I would have different squares for each plantation. So you can do a deep dive within each plantation. And then I've got photographs that are from today, right? And then I actually started this research 30 years ago. I blame Arnold Highfield entirely for this. I took his course to quantify all this. And 30 years later, here I am putting the website together. And I want to, this is to me a piece of community history. And Celeste, I love your question, because this is one of the intents of doing this whole project, was say, how many were there? What can we learn from the stuff that was out there? And so, for instance, they've been doing some archaeology at Little Princess and La Grande Princess, and we learned a lot about that. Well, maybe there's some other places that would be interested in doing some archaeology. Or for your interest, I see place names and I see these names written on a map. What do they mean? How do we now connect that to landowner lists and plantation inventories and other documentary evidence to say, all right, I can start tracing the movement of people coming in, names, dates, places, as best as we can divine, so that you can learn more about your family. And to me, that is extraordinarily exciting that you're interested in that. And you could use the map, the website is a tool, and there's going to be 150 or so different places. So, you're interested in where Creaky Dam is. So that's going to be like Nicholas or Mount Washington. It's something I'm not, I have to look at the current map, but you're interested in up in that northwest corner. Well, there might be somebody that's interested in, say, Estate Pleasant or Mount Pleasant, and there's actually 3 of them, or say Estate Southgate out on the East End. And so there'll be something for people of a lot of different interests. And I'm documenting the windmills. And one reason I chose to look at windmills is, first, you can find them in the field, which is really important. But second, you see how they're depicted on the maps. It's really important, especially in the early history, to know what productive capacity they are. So they survived. I can find them. And once you know where the windmill and how the openings are configured, now you can speculate where all the other structures on the plantation are. So you can go find, all right, where's the boiling house? Where might other living quarters be, and that sort of thing. And that's where I wanted to do this. And I hope that I've answered your question. If there's aspects of it that I haven't, please let me know.
Okay, all right.
No, you answered the question. Just a added piece. There's a young lady. One second, Betsy. There's a young lady that was in FEMA that was doing a lot of stuff, the archaeologist, and she was also doing some mapping. That may be of some interest to you. I'll get the information too.
Okay.
That would be fantastic.
All right. Another question, please. One more question.
I would like to thank Dr. Cleveland for a very interesting presentation. One thing I would like to comment on is that the maps also show a very interesting revelation of the climate change, where several rivers are shown that don't exist today.
Yes.
Yes.
And Nina, I would expand on that a little bit. Not only have a lot of the rivers dried up, although I did find a small rivulet of running surface water in Estate Glen, just to the west of the windmill in Estate Glen on this trip. And I was like, there's a woman that's farming that land she's growing banana. It's like a little nursery, and she's got banana plants and then some, I'm not a plant person, but like decorative plants that people would put around their yard. And I'm like, does this water run all the time? And she's out there all the time. She's got a nursery. And she said, oh yeah, that runs all the time. And I'm like, that's a good thing, because I will say in the last 30 years, the bush has really sprung back, because you have thousands and thousands less head of cattle on St. Croix. And that's one reason I think you have the deer, because the land is going back into bush rather than grass, because you're not maintaining it as pasture. And that might help restore some of the water flow. Just another couple points on this. You talk about climate change. There on the South Shore at the Great Pond Estate that's on the east side of Great Pond. The Parsons map from 1856 shows literally the windmill tower perched at the shoreline, which is farther south than Oxholm did it in 1794. And when I go there, I find a piece of the windmill on the beach. So there's a good sign there that there has been some coastline erosion in that area. And again, some of this is a little bit speculative, but in this case, I'm pretty sure because we're finding an artifact on the beach that I am very convinced is a piece of the old windmill. Okay, you have coastline change. And just a quick aside on climate change and all this, I haven't dove in St. Croix, gone diving in 24 years. And I did 14 dives with my daughter here in the last 2 weeks. And I am shocked to the point of deep concern about the death of the corals, because my recollection is you go over the spur and groove formations and it's just all life, and about half the corals are dead. And that is spurring me to action. It alarms me, because, you know, I had a woman, we went to Buck Island, and the woman that, you know, she's just on the boat, doesn't really understand the stuff. Said, what happens if all the corals die? I said, that is a good question. That is a really good question. And a couple things would happen. First, you're going to lose protection of the land of the corals dying, right? Then so your beaches are going to erode from that. You're also going to lose beaches because the parrotfish don't have anything to eat. The parrotfish disappear. They're not pooping out sand and similar fish. So the beaches won't be replenished by the natural regeneration. And then you have all the ecological disaster with all the life forms that can die. So it's, to me, a very deep concern that we need to be reckoning with.
Right. Okay, all right. Thank you very, very much for your questions, everybody. And for Bill Cleveland, thank you very much. We enjoyed it thoroughly. All right, I
Yes.
think we will have a 5-minute break just to get up and stand up. And while the next speaker comes to the fore and the technical person assists her. Thank you.
And can I just add, feel free to contact me if you have additional questions. The website that I'm building is meant to be a community history page. The first iteration is just going to have a lot of names and dates and that sort of stuff, but it's going to grow. And I really want it to be a place where people can have a conversation and talk about the history, because it's pretty important, I think.
All right, 5 minutes, please.
Thanks.
Bill, I have a quick question, has nothing to do with anyone. It's very site specific.
Mhm.
Lynn and I live at East Hill, which is the East Hill Schoolhouse on the East End.
Okay.
It's the Von Schulten School that sits there on the
Okay.
East End. It's part of Green Key Estate.
Okay.
But the particular plot that we live on, it's plot 1 Green Key, a little
Okay.
hill. You can see it from the road as you drive east. A small hill, but it's not where all the works for Green Key are. Those are a little bit west and on the side where this is on the land side. And I've always wondered, it's all Green Key Estate, right? 300 acres or whatever it was. But why would that hill be plot number 1? In my mind, I would think when you're doing that, you would say plot number 1 is where I'm going to put the most important part of this estate, and it has nothing to do with that. It's just a random little hill on which there was no structure, I think, until 1841 when the school was built. And it's just an odd thing to me.
Right. And even the numbering of the estates themselves, as I interpret the things, it's sort of like at what point the specific estate was occupied, because some of them there's no rhyme or reason to the numbering system. Some of them are extraordinarily ordered and others are just like all over the map. And then as estates got subdivided, I really don't know how they made decisions on that, but that's a really interesting question of, all right, why do you call this 1? Why do you call this 2? Does it mean anything, or is it just kind of the way things happen?
Right. It doesn't relate to anything. The windmill there has a name. It's Cecilia.
Yes.
And that's another thing I've always wondered about, is if some way we can find out who these people were,
Yes, one of my goals with this project looking forward is to answer questions precisely like that, because the date on that stone is 1833, which would be extraordinarily late to build a windmill. And I'm very curious. Some of the dates, I'm like, yeah, pretty much that's the date it was built, especially if it says the word erected and has a date. I'm pretty sure that was not like a misleading thing, that they actually built it then. And these are questions as I go forward that I want to answer and keep keep growing the information on the website so that it becomes more and more of a resource to people. As documents are brought up, you can link to them, and you can learn more about these very specific places. I mean, it's 6 million square feet, 200 by 3,000, 2,000 by 3,000 square feet. It's a pretty small, I mean, in the terms of the entire globe, that's a pretty small, that's hyper-local history. Okay, what happened in this place? Who is this person? And I would love to, much in the way that Cynthia brings a lot of things alive through the dancing, is to bring a lot of this history alive through some personal stories, and just like, okay, this is what we know about this person. Then, okay, here's some of the context of the time in which this person lived. So let's bring that alive further by saying, okay, we might not be able to document this specific person, but they're kind of going through some of these things during this time.
Yeah, it is very specific, because when I researched my own family, I found, first of all, that almost all my whole family's from St. Croix, dating back to about the 1750s.
Okay.
Almost all, except the European men who contributed to it. Not only that, but most of them lived in a small area of Christianstead, and and East and part of East End, and it had nothing much to do with West End, Frederiksted, or beyond until the late 19th century. And that was a surprise, because I always knew growing up, before we did the research, that my mother was from Christiansted, my father was from Frederiksted. So I assumed that there was all this history from Frederiksted having to do with Estate Oxford, which was in my father's family.
Okay.
Come to find out, that didn't happen until late in the 19th century. And there was almost no history from Frederiksted. As I said, it was all Christiansted and East End. And once I knew that, I was able to find all the people in the family. Yes. So it would be great to be able to have some kind of tool that we could take a map, and because you've got addresses and names when you do this research, and put a little pin, and so you could physically then see on the map of St. Croix where your family was and when.
Right. So you're basically saying the movement of individuals.
Yes.
And I think that would be fascinating, because so much of this is so interesting. You hear stories about, enslaved people being split up from their families, or having specific skills, being bought and sold, moved from place to place. And that's really, I think, very fascinating information for, what might have been going on there. How did relationships get created? What relationships were broken? Were those broken relationships ever resumed? What fascinating personal narratives. And what you're saying is possible to do. And I'm seeing, like, maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, adding that kind of
that would be great
capacity, because I want this to be useful for people and engaging. And, to me, as somebody, the first time I came to St. Croix, I'm 21 years old. So I don't have long roots here. So I don't have necessarily a personal stake, but I count St. Croix as my home, even though I don't live here right now. But I love this place, and I find it fascinating because you can answer some of these questions. Other communities I've lived in, I don't think you could answer these questions. Memphis, Tennessee, I'm pretty sure it would be pretty cumbersome to answer this kind of question. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, pretty hard. But St. Croix, you can actually answer some of these questions. And so you can bring this history alive and make it relevant to people today. Because it's like, wait, that person is my ancestor, or like, I know that entire family, and also the place names. And, we talk about physical locations as being excruciatingly important. Okay, I've seen that. And I think a lot of people think that what they see today has always existed. And one of the points of history is to remind yourself that, okay, it was different 30 years ago. It was different 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So looking forward in 30 and 50 years, it's going to be different from today. So I think a lot of people get caught in the present and think that the present is all of history and all of the future. I'm like, no, this is very transient, and we're just moving through. And I think that it's important to remember that. And some of these records and the ruins that stand are a visual testament to the fact that, things change. And I love your suggestion. I
Yes.
have bookmarked that, and I think I'm going to start doing a newsletter once the mill
Yes,
gets.
that would be well. That
to
would be
keep
wonderful.
people- to keep people up to date of changes to the site, and also solicit information of what would you find interesting? What would you
Yes.
find interesting? And then we can see what we can develop.
Right. Exactly.
And
Yes.
to me, you make history accessible to people, to regular people,
Right.
not people that are scholars,
Yes.
because everybody's history is relevant to them. How can I make it relevant to Julie Frederickson? How can I make it? Now I'm thinking that Lynn Frederickson and Julie Frederickson, looking at the name, you're probably related. Just thinking.
We're
right?
sisters. We're sisters.
Imagine that. So you're going to have something common, which is different. I see Joseph Hurd on there. I'm thinking that his history might be a little different, right?
Well, let me just quickly say to you, because this is St. Croix we're talking about, Joseph's wife, Jean, is our cousin.
Oh,
Well, and so this is perfect, so that if we can start collecting information, say you have your family history and we can get that posted on the website, then all this extended family can say, oh, I have a link into that. Look at how interesting this is. And with a guy with a last name like Cleveland, you might have recognized that there was the only US president that served 2 non-consecutive terms. I share an ancestor with him back 13 generations. And then there's a small city on Lake Erie. Well, that was an ancestor of mine that worked for the state of Connecticut as a surveyor. He went out and surveyed the land. They named the settlement after him. And so I have this very vague notion from my personal history, but I can't escape it with my name because it's so obvious to people. And it's not it's not a particularly uncommon name, but it's not a really common name. So, it's pretty notable. And, when I've read, my family has a genealogy, my first ancestor that came to North America, he came in 1640. So, 20 years, one generation after the Mayflower set sail, right? And he was an indentured servant that was 10 years old, and he lived near York, England, and 10 years old, and they're shipping him to North America because there's nothing for him to do in York. It's like, bye, see you, don't forget to call. Oh, wait, you can't call, you have to write. And I just put myself in the mind of, okay, this little 10-year-old boy is getting on a boat, going into something that's completely unknown. And then I relate it to what I've learned about the indentured servitude in the Caribbean. I'm like, okay, basically a death sentence for all the indentured servants that come to the Caribbean, single digit survival rate. Those are bad odds. And here my ancestor, I think the survival rate was much better in North America. And here I have an ancestor that if he hadn't survived, I wouldn't exist. And so to me, I don't in no way bragging about my personal history, but just to make it relevant to people and I can identify with it is just like, okay, this is to me very fascinating that you have the whole complexion of history and people making conscious decisions on a daily basis of what am I going to do and how is that going to shape the future? And just remember that the decisions we make today will shape the future in 100 years, And so, to me, it all ties it together to say, your actions today do have consequences. As stupid as that may seem, it makes a difference, especially big decisions. So enough of my pontification.
all right. We have much to think about. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you so much. It's good to see you.
Likewise, I can't wait to be back.
All right.
Couple months.
Okay. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye.